on Power Talk AM 1460 and FM 101.1. Streaming worldwide on iHeartRadio. Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show.
You are listening to The Jan Price Show, and today I have two award-winning guests on my show. Award-winning director Anthony Wonke and award-winning writer-producer Richard Kerbaj. And we're going to be talking about their brand new HBO documentary, Unmasking Jihadi John. Welcome to the show, Anthony and Richard.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to have you here. Okay, I have lots of questions. I'm going to start with Richard, since you wrote this. Richard, obviously this is a very pertinent story for today and is in something that we all need to know more about, but what inspired you to decide to make this documentary and write it?
Yeah, so I want to do a story about the formation and collapse of ISIS. Obviously, ISIS was dominating the headlines back in 2014 when they declared their so-called caliphate, their Islamic State. And so from that moment, there was a lot of interest in among journalists in sort of interrogating their backstory, but also looking at how they're driving their recruitment campaign. And so over the ensuing months in 2014, it became quite clear that they operated and functioned a lot differently than other terrorist organizations. Although their ideology was similar to other terrorist organizations, including, say, Al-Qaeda, their recruitment campaigns were different. But then they had this enormous spike in recruitment when the assassination, the execution of Jim Foley was broadcast to the world. And what was so savage about that video and what was so brutal was that it was an attack that was being carried out by a Western terrorist, namely someone with a British accent who was donning a mask. And I think for ISIS, at least, that sort of became a successful experiment for them, because as a result of all the news that generated around the world, they were able to sort of replicate that. And so that sort of continued to expand their recruitment campaign. And so around that time, I started thinking, well, I want to do a story that kind of captures the overall state of ISIS. And Jihadi John embodied so much of what that terrorist organization represented. I mean, he's evil, he's barbaric, he's disgusting. And so he was sort of a good way into telling the wider story about the formation and collapse of ISIS, the threat of the ideology which has outlived ISIS and will continue to outlive ISIS, and the recruitment drive that they ran and the way that they kind of weaponized social media by using it to recruit and using it to broadcast their messages.
It was very effective the way that they did it, but for people who may not know who Jihadi John was, and Anthony, can you just enlighten the listeners a little bit in case for some reason they've forgotten who Jihadi John was?
Well, Jihadi John was a young boy born into a family in Kuwait, and they were part of a tribe called the Badoon tribe that were actually victimized and ostracized, and in the end they decided to leave Kuwait, come to England. So he came to England when he was about 6 years old, and they moved to northwest London, around the Maida Vale area, which is actually a very affluent and wealthy area of West London. And he then started attending normal schools, was at primary school, which is junior school, and then went to a very prestigious academy called Quinton Kinningston. And there, this is where we actually get footage of him in the film, which is something that's really quite extraordinary.
Yes.
That and complete kind of chance that there just happened to be a documentary crew at that time that were making a documentary about the school, and there is rushes, which are the actual footage that you shoot, of Mwazi in the playground, and he's with friends, he's laughing about, he's kind of in the playground, and he's on the computer, and at various times he's kind of covering his mouth. And we later on explore is part of something that was a symptom that kind of made people bully him and made him very self-conscious, but in the end, without giving too much away in the film, it partially led to his downfall, in the sense because he had bad teeth, and then he was in Kuwait and decided to come back to England for dentistry work. But Mwazi then became radicalized as a young man, and he got involved with some young want-to-be jihadis who wanted to make their way over to Somalia, and then that's where he suddenly became on the radar of the intelligence services, and they then kind of realised that they wanted to try to kind of monitor this man and realised that he had ambition to go and fight the holy jihad. And then slowly but surely, he would basically try as hard as he could to travel out to one of these theatres, and the terrorist units were trying to sort of thwart his travel as much as possible. And eventually he made his way to Syria, and eventually he joined ISIS, and then obviously he came into the world view when he kind of he made those Message to America films, where he's beheading James Foley and other hostages. So it's really this is what's relatively remarkable about this. That this is a young boy who had got quite conservative ideals and a relatively religious family background, and from a very, very steep trajectory, he turned from a conservative young lad to this extreme terrorist and global jihadist, and over a very short period of time, and was one of many. But did this at the time. It just so happened that he became so notorious because of these videos.
It's obviously it horrified the world when we saw those videos. But I was curious. I mean, you did answer the question of how you got the early footage of him in school. I mean, I was amazed. So there was a documentary team already there filming the school. For what reason? Why were they there, Anthony?
They were making it was about the head teacher, and it was about school. It was about how a school had become this young academy, and it was just a kind of fly on the wall documentary observing a year in the life of this school. And I remember seeing scenes of this documentary used in news outlets around Europe. I never remember seeing it in America. And so obviously then we understood that it existed, and we contacted the filmmaker and, negotiated with them, and then managed to get hold of that material. And it is quite incredible. It's quite incredible that this exists, and you see him at a young age. And obviously then we have the teachers who talk about him and describe what he was like as a young man.
It is quite incredible, truly quite incredible. Richard, how difficult was it for you? Because there are many people who are in this documentary. It is a really eye-opening documentary that I highly recommend to everyone on HBO, but we'll talk more about that as we go forward here. To get General Petraeus to talk, and Jesse Morton and Diane Foley, who is the mother of James Foley. I mean, there's a whole list of people, and we'll talk a little bit about each one of them. And because you could see the pain that was there for all of them, for not for Petraeus obviously, but certainly the others, the Diane Foley and Bethany Haynes and Nicholas Hennon and Federica Mata. How hard was it to get them, and how difficult was it for them to speak about their experience over there?
Yeah, well, I think I'll split that question into two parts, because you've got sort of the families and the hostages, and then you've got the contributors who are part of the operation to track down, locate, and subsequently kill Mwazi. So on the latter, the people who were part of the operation, I had a sense of what the operation kind of looked like, because I'd done numerous stories through my reporting on counterterrorism and intelligence, the Sunday Times newspaper in London, and I started connecting with some of the people who were part of the operation. So I had a sense of what the military and intelligence operation was, but it was about being able to draw it out from the right contributors who both had an original insight into it, who were also authentic and credible, and also honest. And I think that's one of the key bits that I want to sort of raise here, because I think all of the contributors were quite honest about some of the missteps that were taken, and they were quite self-reflective in quite a refreshing way that you don't usually get with former officials or current officials, because quite often you find people sort of talking about operations as if it was just a win and that's the end of it. In their case, they really were quite self-critical about some parts of the operation, and particularly about how Jihadi John went on to become a terrorist. From the family's perspective, and from the hostages' perspective, yeah, they certainly were. You were right. They certainly were the emotional heart of the film, because they they represented the greatest things within each of us. So, for instance, Diane Foley, in particular, she was so incredible and so moving because of her resilience. But also, she bears no grudge. What's fascinating about her is that she wants to go out there and continue carrying on her son's legacy and doing good in the world,
yes,
as opposed to just reflecting on all the bad things that were done. And in that same sort of strand, you have these former hostages who contributed to the film. They too were out there, like her son, doing good things in this world. In one case, one of them was an aid worker trying to help destabilized and dislocated Syrians who were staying in refugee camps. And another case with Nicholas Hennon, he was out there actually to report on what was happening on the ground. So they were out there for very good reasons. And I think a lot of people who did go out to Syria went out there for good reasons as well. And versus the terrorists who went out. So in terms of getting them on board, I think everyone who came on board had something to do with the story, whether it was the hostages or the families or the intelligence operatives. They weren't just there as commentators. They weren't just talking heads. They were invested in the story. It was part of, what happened to them as well. And I think that's why they were so honest, so compelling. So trying to get them on board, again, it was, throughout time, after several conversations, they could see what the direction of the film was going to be and what we were trying to say by making this film. And so they agreed to come on board.
Well, yeah, that's a blessing that they all agreed to come on board for sure. Anthony, did you try to get Mohammed Emwazi's family on camera to have them talk about their son?
We did, and I know that Richard had tried to approach them years earlier. The family have gone underground, and we did try various avenues, but in the end, it wasn't possible. And they are now in hiding, or they've changed their identities, and so it's very difficult to sort of track where they are. And in some ways, it's they're not responsible for him in a sense of what his actions and what happened to him. And I think it's one of these, you have to make these judgment calls about how far do you try to push for something like this, and realize what those consequences would be for them. But also at the same time, I think that we knew that we would have a lot of characters to be able to tell this story in different ways. And so, yeah, you do start off wanting to try to kind of approach these people, but it was part of a process of many tricky ethical discussions and conversations and decisions that we were making on a daily basis whilst doing this film, because it is such a sensitive area, and we were sort of very mindful about what voices we were going to use to help tell the story. So, it was a consideration, but in the end, it never happened.
And probably would have changed the tone of the film a little bit too if they were on the film, but it would have been interesting to hear their perspective. If you're just tuning in, I am talking today with award-winning director Anthony Wonke and award-winning writer and producer Richard Kerbaj, and we're talking about their new HBO documentary, Unmasking Jihadi John. In this, you talked with Jesse Morton, who was a convicted Al-Qaeda recruiter. Tell me a little bit about him and his story, because I was not aware of him until I saw this documentary. Richard, can you answer a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So Jesse Morton sort of comes from self-declared criminal background. He was running drugs at a young age, and then ultimately he was convicted, and then he converted to Islam, and then he went on to become an Al-Qaeda recruiter, and so which is quite an unusual journey. And what was fascinating about his journey is how able he was in his recruitment drives. He's incredibly eloquent and very bright, and he was able to sort of weaponize information also weaponized the sort of his interpretation of the religion. And he became quite a successful recruiter, particularly because he was able to kind of push the message out with the right tone and without sort of attracting the authorities' attention. So although the authorities sort of had him under surveillance, they knew that he was out there. He just knew how far he could push each message. But ultimately, he pushed it a little bit too far when him and his a member of his organization, I think it was called Revolution Muslim, issued a death threat against the makers of South Park, and subsequently he went on the run. Then the FBI tracked him down. He was convicted for his views and for his recruitment. And so he's quite a fascinating. He gives quite a fascinating take on recruitment because he understands it. He understands the process of radicalizing people, and as he sort of points out in the film, he says it's not. It is a process that takes place over time. So initially, you sort of recruit people on, and you reinforce everything that's great in their life, and you give them a sense of sort of kinship and friendship, and you draw them in. And eventually, you start sort of pushing them towards the towards violence. And so what was fascinating is sort of getting an understanding of ISIS through someone who's been there before, through someone who understands the religion and who understands the weaponization of the extremist elements of that religion.
Do you think he had any regrets after this? And is he still in prison, or is he out? I mean, it didn't look like he was in prison in the film, but I was just curious.
He's out of prison, and totally he has a great deal of regrets. In fact, that's why he's now working in countering extremism. He's gone completely to the other side now. Having initially been part of the problem, he now knows how to sort of approach the problem from the other side to try to sort of discredit some of the arguments that are being made by other recruiters who followed in his wake. But he obviously realizes how much damage he caused, particularly in the U.S., because he was one of the most prolific recruiters and one of the loudest voices, and he was seen as a really authentic figure within the extremist circles.
It's fascinating. I mean, Anthony, how could somebody like that? I mean, again, he goes one direction. I mean, again, it's just a very strange journey to be on, as you said, Richard. And then now that he was convicted, and then go the other direction, how can we really trust that him at this stage to do what he says he's going to do? That's to Anthony.
It's difficult to tell, but I think so. I think that these are very smart guys, well, Jesse in particular, and I don't know. We had an interview with him. I know that Richard had various conversations with him. I think that they get to a point where they realise the error of their ways, and I think that type of and they've managed to contextualise their life. And I think they've seen, I think probably through their own ability to manipulate others, and to be clever enough to be able to do that they have got then that insight and that introspection to make those decisions and think to themselves, yeah, actually, no, what I did was fundamentally wrong. Plus, incarceration and and the things that go with that. So, I do definitely I got the impression that he wanted to change. And he is. I mean, he is part of a de-radicalization program. He's in different sorts of outreach. And you do get a sense that he has got serious convictions about all of these things. And, you have to think that there are other characters in our film who did go out for and fight holy wars, some in Afghanistan and some other places, who have gone through that process and have realized kind of the error of their ways and how they somehow were manipulated or taken in or would propagate this kind of perceived grievance. And which would then lead to this kind of extremism. And as Richard says, they are the kind of, in a sense, the experts of this, because they have been inside it. They have done it to people and it has been done to them. So I I'm an optimist in life, and I'm optimistic when I meet people, and I meet lots of people when you make film. And I was definitely under the impression that he is taking a different path, and let's just say it's a more righteous path.
Well, that's good to hear. It really is good to hear that there's some redemption in some of this. When you were putting together this documentary initially, and I'll direct this to Richard, was it always going to be produced by HBO, or did you just go ahead and start creating this documentary and then sell it to HBO?
Yes, there were several steps in the process. So initially, I do my own development on my own films, and then I approached Channel 4 actually in the UK, who provided some funding, and then HBO came on board, sort of a little bit further down track, and they played an enormous role in helping shape the film, expand the vision, and elevate some of our thinking on it. And that's a great thing about collaborating with people who are experts in their field, particularly someone like Anthony Wonke, who's been doing this. I mean, this is kind of his 40th film, I think. So for me, at least, as someone this is my third film, he really elevated my own thinking and my own sort of understanding of filmmaking, but also kind of he helped me see the film beyond just the initial story of the hunt for Jihadi John. It became much bigger and better as a result of working with him.
I think it's interesting that whether or not when you make films like this, you have subject matters like this that as filmmakers you go out and you have your meetings and you go and pitch to various people, but ultimately they find you somehow, or that and it becomes a natural fit. And I've done stuff with HBO before, and I remember saying to Richard, we should really go for these guys because they're great, and I think they have got the best reputation for this type of documentary, as well as the News and Current Affairs department at Channel 4. And they've done consistently over the years lots of these very heavy-hitting, difficult investigations and around sensitive areas, especially around Syria and Iraq. So it was, they're a very good fit, and they've just got such a good track record, and they were very good. They just let us get on with it, and they've been very supportive.
Well, they are the best. HBO for documentaries, its reputation is absolutely the best in the industry. So you really definitely teamed up with the right partner on this for sure. This will premiere on July 31st on HBO, and I highly recommend that everyone seek this out because it's a fascinating study about how someone who is nondescript actually and can go from 0 to 180 and become this international diabolical terrorist. And it's just fascinating. I think it really captured all of our attention for sure when we saw what they were doing. So thank you both for for putting this movie together, because I think it's very significant and very, very important. So I highly recommend everybody look for it on July 31st on HBO, and thank both of you for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. You have been listening to The Jan Price Show, all about movies, and my guests today have been award-winning director Anthony Wonke and award-winning producer and writer Richard Kerbaj, and we're talking about Unmasking Jihadi John, which will be on HBO on July 31st. If you would like to listen to past shows that you may have missed, you can go to thejanpriceshow.com, and also you can go to iHeart's podcast channel. And to find out what's coming up on The Jan Price Show, check out The Jan Price Show on Facebook and like it while you're there. Thank you.
On Power Talk AM 1460 and FM 101.1, streaming worldwide on iHeartRadio. Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show.
The Ozio Theater in downtown Monterey is now open every day, showing independent and foreign films. The Ozio Theater has new concession offerings, including beer, wine, hard cider, and their homemade lush slush. You can now schedule private event screenings for community charity events, birthdays, anniversaries, or just a fun gathering of friends. For more information, visit the Ozio Theater online at oziotheater.com.